Athens, 420 BC. A 15-year-old boy lies naked on the cold surface of marble. His body glistens with olive oil, not for comfort, but for display. A brazier smolders in the corner, its smoke clinging to the air, while flickering light casts shifting shadows across frescoed walls where gods themselves are painted in intimate embrace. He has been held in this position for hours. Silent. Motionless. Trained not to resist. Above him, the symposium is alive with laughter and debate, men raising cups of wine while discussing virtue, justice, and the very meaning of morality. Perhaps Socrates himself is among them. Their words soar toward ideals that will shape Western thought for centuries. But here, below the polished floors, another truth waits. This boy is not a guest, nor a seeker of wisdom. He is property. Purchased at the slave market for 300 drachmas, more than most Athenian families would ever earn. Not for his hands in labor, but for his youth, his beauty, his body. Tonight, he is an ornament prepared for the desires of Athens' elite. A silent reminder that the same city celebrated as the cradle of democracy and philosophy also hid within it a darker world, one where innocence was currency, and exploitation thrived in the shadows. When most people think of Athens in the 5th century BC, they imagine marble temples gleaming in the sun, philosophers debating in the agora, and the proud birth of democracy. It is the city of Pericles and Plato, of the Parthenon and the Acropolis, symbols that still stand today as monuments to human achievement. But the Athens of reality was far more complicated, and far darker, than the postcard version we often celebrate. Beneath the marble and philosophy was a society built on hierarchy and exploitation. Roughly half of its people lived not as citizens, but as property, slaves, women, and foreigners who had no political voice and no legal protection. The ideals of liberty and equality applied only to a narrow circle of freeborn men. Within this world, practices that modern society would recognize as abuse were not just tolerated, they were honored. Elite men treated sexual access to youth as both a privilege and a cultural tradition, cloaking it in rituals of refinement. In fact, many Athenians believed it was a mark of sophistication. Your master, Critias, stood at the center of this paradox. Outwardly, he was everything an Athenian gentleman was expected to be: wealthy, educated, and well-connected. His home stretched across nearly an entire city block, adorned with mosaics and sculptures imported from across the Mediterranean. Guests at his table included generals, historians, and statesmen, the very people shaping Athens' destiny. But his wealth was not earned through trade or inheritance. Critias profited from flesh. He was what we might call today a trafficker, running a household that doubled as a brothel for the city's most powerful men. His business thrived because of the symposium, the cornerstone of elite Athenian social life. The symposium was part banquet, part drinking party, and part intellectual salon. On the surface, it was a place where men gathered to eat, drink, and discuss philosophy. But it was also a carefully staged theater of indulgence, where enslaved boys and young men were presented as entertainment. The setting gave their exploitation a veneer of sophistication. And it wasn't just individual corruption, it was cultural. The very philosophers who wrote about virtue provided the intellectual framework that allowed this system to flourish. Plato himself, in his dialogues, described love between older men and adolescent boys as the highest and purest form of human connection, nobler even than marriage. This philosophy gave moral cover to practices that, in reality, were systems of exploitation. So while Athens gave the world democracy and philosophy, it also built its greatness on contradictions. It was a city that praised liberty while denying it to most of its people, and that celebrated virtue while justifying acts that, by today's standards, we would call deeply abusive. When most people think of Athens in the 5th century BC, they imagine marble temples gleaming in the sun, philosophers debating in the agora, and the proud birth of democracy. It is the city of Pericles and Plato, of the Parthenon and the Acropolis, symbols that still stand today as monuments to human achievement. But the Athens of reality was far more complicated, and far darker, than the postcard version we often celebrate. Beneath the marble and philosophy was a society built on hierarchy and exploitation. Roughly half of its people lived not as citizens, but as property, slaves, women, and foreigners who had no political voice and no legal protection. The ideals of liberty and equality applied only to a narrow circle of freeborn men. Within this world, practices that modern society would recognize as abuse were not just tolerated, they were honored. Elite men treated sexual access to youth as both a privilege and a cultural tradition, cloaking it in rituals of refinement. In fact, many Athenians believed it was a mark of sophistication. When most people think of Athens in the 5th century BC, they imagine marble temples gleaming in the sun, philosophers debating in the agora, and the proud birth of democracy. It is the city of Pericles and Plato, of the Parthenon and the Acropolis, symbols that still stand today as monuments to human achievement. But the Athens of reality was far more complicated, and far darker, than the postcard version we often celebrate. Beneath the marble and philosophy was a society built on hierarchy and exploitation. Roughly half of its people lived not as citizens, but as property, slaves, women, and foreigners who had no political voice and no legal protection. The ideals of liberty and equality applied only to a narrow circle of freeborn men. Within this world, practices that modern society would recognize as abuse were not just tolerated, they were honored. Elite men treated sexual access to youth as both a privilege and a cultural tradition, cloaking it in rituals of refinement. In fact, many Athenians believed it was a mark of sophistication. Your master, Critias, stood at the center of this paradox. Outwardly, he was everything an Athenian gentleman was expected to be: wealthy, educated, and well-connected. His home stretched across nearly an entire city block, adorned with mosaics and sculptures imported from across the Mediterranean. Guests at his table included generals, historians, and statesmen, the very people shaping Athens' destiny. But his wealth was not earned through trade or inheritance. Critias profited from flesh. He was what we might call today a trafficker, running a household that doubled as a brothel for the city's most powerful men. His business thrived because of the symposium, the cornerstone of elite Athenian social life. The symposium was part banquet, part drinking party, and part intellectual salon. On the surface, it was a place where men gathered to eat, drink, and discuss philosophy. But it was also a carefully staged theater of indulgence, where enslaved boys and young men were presented as entertainment. The setting gave their exploitation a veneer of sophistication. And it wasn't just individual corruption, it was cultural. The very philosophers who wrote about virtue provided the intellectual framework that allowed this system to flourish. Plato himself, in his dialogues, described love between older men and adolescent boys as the highest and purest form of human connection, nobler even than marriage. This philosophy gave moral cover to practices that, in reality, were systems of exploitation. So while Athens gave the world democracy and philosophy, it also built its greatness on contradictions. It was a city that praised liberty while denying it to most of its people, and that celebrated virtue while justifying acts that, by today's standards, we would call deeply abusive. To understand the world you've been drawn into, you need to understand the man who owns you. Critias is not simply a wealthy Athenian. He is a broker of beauty, a man who has turned youth into currency. His household, vast and ornate, is more than a residence, it is an institution designed to feed the appetites of Athens' most powerful men. By day, Critias can pass as a respectable citizen. He debates in public, recites poetry, and joins conversations about justice and government. But behind closed doors, his wealth is fueled by a market that few admit openly yet many participate in, the buying, training, and presentation of enslaved youths. The symposium provided the perfect stage for this hidden economy. For the uninitiated, a symposium might appear to be little more than a banquet, a gathering of educated men sharing food, wine, and philosophy. But within its rituals lay another layer, the systematic use of enslaved bodies for entertainment. Wine flowed, ideas were exchanged, and in the same space, children. This wasn't the secret vice of a handful of men. It was an accepted institution woven into the very fabric of elite Athenian life. What today would be condemned as systematic abuse was, in Athens, elevated as cultural tradition. The intellectual defenses were as elaborate as they were disturbing. Philosophers claimed that relationships between men and adolescent boys were not simply physical, but spiritual. They spoke of such bonds as pathways to higher truth, insisting that beauty inspired wisdom, and that submission prepared youths for citizenship. These arguments dressed exploitation in the language of philosophy, transforming abuse into what was described as education. And so, in Critias' household, nothing happened by accident. Every detail of preparation, from the oil that glistened on your skin to the way you were trained to read a guest's unspoken desires, was part of a larger system. It was a system that blurred the line between culture and cruelty, convincing its participants that what they were doing was not only acceptable but noble. The symposium culture of Athens revealed a haunting contradiction. The same men who shaped Western thought, who debated freedom and justice, also engineered a social world where the exploitation of the vulnerable was routine, celebrated, and defended as the height of civilization. Life inside Critias' household followed a strict rhythm, one designed not only to preserve appearances but to shape obedience. Every morning began with ritual. You were bathed in water perfumed with costly imports, rose from Egypt, myrrh from Arabia. Your skin was rubbed with oils worth more than a common citizen earned in a month, leaving your body glistening, ready to be displayed. Your hair was curled and styled according to fashion, framing your face in ways meant to exaggerate your youth and blur the line between masculine and feminine beauty. Even your meals were chosen with calculation. Food was not meant to nourish, but to refine your appearance, fresh fruit for skin tone, limited portions to preserve a slender frame. These daily preparations were not luxuries. They were investments. Every detail of your presentation increased your value in the eyes of wealthy patrons, ensuring Critias' reputation as a man who could provide the finest entertainment. Yet the physical preparation was only half the system. The other half was psychological. From the moment you entered this house, you were taught to read a man's appetite before he spoke, to recognize subtle gestures, tones of voice, even the rhythm of laughter. You learned quickly which guests preferred silence, which demanded feigned resistance, and which took pleasure in cruelty. Older boys taught you unspoken rules of survival. Never display real fear, it ruins the illusion. Never show affection toward another slave, bonding is punished with separation. And never resist outright, defiance leads not to freedom, but to starvation, beatings, or being sold to masters with reputations for worse brutality. Most important of all, you learn to withdraw inward. To float above yourself during the worst moments, wearing the mask of compliance while hiding whatever scraps of self remained untouched. This dissociation was not weakness, it was survival. In this way, each day blurred into the next. Beauty polished. Obedience rehearsed. Humanity hollowed out. What looked to outsiders like refinement was, in truth, a carefully engineered system of control. Critias' household was not an exception. It was a reflection of a larger culture that prized youth as a commodity, wrapped cruelty in philosophy, and taught children to endure what history often prefers to forget. As evening falls, Critias' house transforms. Servants arrange couches in precise order, lay out imported delicacies, and pour wine into polished cups. The symposium is more than a party, it is a stage where Athens' most powerful men perform both intellect and indulgence. The guest list reads like a roll call of the city's elite. Generals, politicians, philosophers, and poets gather beneath Critias' roof. Some will one day be remembered in history books for their military brilliance or their contributions to philosophy. Yet here, behind closed doors, they are remembered for something else entirely. Tonight, the entertainment is not only the wine or the debates but the presentation of enslaved youths. Boys prepared like offerings are brought forward as part of the evening's spectacle. The laughter from upstairs, the quotations from Homer, the sharp exchanges about the nature of justice, all of it provides a veneer of sophistication. Beneath it, something far more disturbing unfolds. What makes these gatherings particularly haunting is not only the abuse itself, but the way it was dressed in intellectual justification. A man could quote Sappho while appraising the body of a child. He could discuss the ideal state while indulging appetites that revealed the stark inequalities at the heart of Athens. Philosophy became a mask. Ideas about love between older men and younger boys were elevated as the highest form of human connection, supposedly pure, supposedly spiritual. But in practice, it gave cover to exploitation. What might have looked like education or mentorship on the surface was, for those living it, orchestrated trauma. And the contradiction was staggering. These were men celebrated as visionaries of democracy, architects of justice, fathers of Western thought. Yet in the glow of symposium nights, they revealed a truth that history often hides: Athens' cultural achievements were built alongside, and sometimes upon, the suffering of its most vulnerable. The symposium was not an aberration. It was an institution. A place where ideas and appetites blurred until the abuse of the powerless seemed not only acceptable, but natural. To fully understand Athenian society, one must look beyond the symposium walls. The exploitation of youth was only one part of a broader sexual culture that rested on inequality and power. Women, too, lived within a system where their bodies and choices were tightly controlled. For most Athenian wives, life meant seclusion. Married young, often between the ages of 12 and 15, they were confined to the household, rarely seen in public and never involved in the debates that defined civic life. Marriage was not a partnership but a transaction, arranged by fathers to secure alliances and transfer property. A girl's consent was irrelevant. Her role was to produce legitimate heirs, not to seek pleasure or autonomy. There were exceptions: though carefully defined ones. The hetaira, or courtesans, occupied a different space in Athenian culture. Unlike wives, these women were educated. They could read, converse about philosophy, even influence politics through their relationships with powerful men. Yet their independence came at a price. They existed only as long as they could captivate wealthy patrons. Their freedom was conditional, their survival tied to beauty and wit. Religious life, too, provided its own troubling stage. Festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, often involved ritualized sexual practices. Participants engaged in acts meant to dissolve boundaries, cross-dressing, group rites, and performances where indulgence was reframed as spiritual enlightenment. These ceremonies were not spontaneous expressions of devotion, but carefully orchestrated outlets that allowed behaviors unacceptable in daily life to be cloaked in divine approval. Elsewhere, in sanctuaries such as the cult of Artemis at Ephesus, young girls served as temple prostitutes before marriage. Parents sometimes paid for their daughters' participation, believing temporary sexual servitude prepared them for the roles of wives and mothers. What we would call trauma was reinterpreted as initiation, reframed as sacred duty. Taken together, these practices show a pattern. In Athens, sexuality was rarely about mutual desire or equality. It was about hierarchy, men over women, citizens over slaves, elders over youth. The structures that gave the city its brilliance also allowed exploitation to be ritualized, intellectualized, and, above all, normalized. In Athens, marriage was never a matter of love. It was a contract, a transaction between men in which women were the currency. A girl's future was decided not by her own choice but by the needs of her father and the ambitions of her husband-to-be. Most brides were little more than children. 12, 13, perhaps 14 years old, their bodies barely matured, their lives carefully sheltered. They were paired with men often twice their age, sometimes older still. These unions were not whispered about as scandalous, they were the expected order of things. The process was starkly impersonal. Fathers negotiated dowries, bundles of money, land, or household goods, meant to secure a marriage and bind families together. Once the agreement was struck, the girl was transferred like property. In legal terms, she was not a participant in the contract but part of the exchange itself. Weddings themselves carried ritual weight. The girl was bathed, dressed in ceremonial robes, her hair bound in ways symbolizing her submission to her husband's household. At the feast, she was displayed before family and friends, not as an equal partner but as proof of the alliance. That night, she was led to the marriage bed, her childhood replaced with obligations she had no power to refuse. For Athenian men, wives were never companions in the modern sense. A good wife was expected to remain indoors, managing the household and producing sons. She was kept apart from political life, intellectual conversation, or the pleasures of public festivals. If her husband sought passion, he found it elsewhere, in courtesans, in prostitutes, in boys trained for the symposium. This separation reveals a cruel truth. Athens, the city that spoke endlessly of freedom, built its society on women who had none. Their marriages were not unions of affection but chains of duty, forged in childhood and fastened for life. In Critias' household, the cycle never ended. As one boy grew older, another was brought in to replace him. Fresh faces, younger bodies, each prepared to step into the roles that others could no longer fill. The demand was constant, and so the supply had to be as well. The transition was brutal but predictable. Those who had endured for years became instructors of sorts, teaching the newcomers the unspoken rules of survival. They passed on warnings in hushed tones, how to read a guest's mood, how to avoid punishment, how to disappear into yourself when there was no escape. For the older boys, this mentorship was not an act of kindness alone, it was a way of giving meaning to their own suffering, of convincing themselves it had served some purpose. But the system had no room for sentiment. Once a boy's youth began to fade, when his voice deepened, when his body broadened, his value diminished. Some were discarded, sold into harsher labor, their beauty no longer profitable. Others, if lucky, found obscure work as servants, clinging to anonymity in households less notorious. A few, rarely, might rise within the city, their past hidden, their survival owed to silence. For those who remained in the cycle, innocence collapsed quickly. What should have been years of discovery and play became years of endurance. Laughter learned in childhood was replaced with the practiced smile of performance. Affection was replaced with suspicion, trust with strategy. Survival demanded it. And Athens allowed it. The very men who championed liberty for the citizen body had no qualms about chaining the vulnerable into roles they could not escape. As one generation of boys was broken, another was brought in, an endless exchange of innocence for pleasure, dressed in the language of culture and philosophy. This was the hidden cost of Athenian brilliance, a cycle of exploitation that consumed its children, ensured silence, and left scars invisible to history's monuments. Athens is remembered as the birthplace of democracy, the cradle of philosophy, the city where human reason was elevated above superstition. Its orators praised freedom, its philosophers debated justice, and its citizens celebrated their role in shaping the destiny of the Western world. Yet behind this glittering image lay shadows that history often refuses to confront. The very men who spoke so passionately of liberty sat in symposium halls where the bodies of children were treated as entertainment. They crafted speeches on equality while maintaining a society built on the labor of slaves. They debated the nature of virtue, even as their private lives exposed a hierarchy where women, foreigners, and the young were denied any measure of dignity. This contradiction was not hidden from Athenians themselves. They knew their freedom rested on exclusion. Only male citizens born of citizen parents had the right to participate in democracy. Women, no matter their intelligence or talent, were barred. Enslaved people, no matter their skill, had no voice. And children, especially those caught in the grip of households like Critias, were left entirely unprotected. What makes this tension haunting is not simply the hypocrisy, it is the fact that Athens' ideals and abuses grew side by side. The same culture that gave the world Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle also normalized practices that shattered lives. To praise the brilliance without acknowledging the brutality is to tell only half the story. Athens teaches us that civilization can achieve greatness while hiding cruelty in its foundations. Its monuments to freedom were built not in spite of exploitation, but alongside it. And in that contradiction lies a warning: human progress does not always erase human suffering, it can just as easily conceal it. When we think of Athens, we imagine marble temples, brilliant debates, and the birth of democracy. We remember the philosophers whose words still echo in classrooms today, the generals whose strategies are studied centuries later, the artists whose vision shaped the Western world. The city stands as a symbol of human possibility, a reminder of what culture and intellect can achieve. But beneath the marble lies another story. A story rarely carved into stone or sung by poets. It is the story of children stripped of innocence, of women confined to silence, of lives treated as property in a society that spoke so loudly of freedom. These hidden horrors were not accidents on the margins, they were part of the very structure that allowed Athens to flourish. The brilliance of Athens and its brutality were inseparable. Its ideals were lofty, but its practices were cruel. To admire one without acknowledging the other is to accept a half-truth, a polished image that erases those who suffered to sustain it. History often prefers heroes to victims. Yet to understand Athens fully, we must hold both in view, the grandeur of its achievements and the shadows it cast. Only then can we see the city as it truly was, not a flawless beacon of civilization, but a place where human brilliance and human cruelty walked hand in hand. And in remembering this, we are left with a final truth: every age, no matter how enlightened it claims to be, must be judged not only by the ideals it proclaims, but by the lives it sacrifices in their name.